There we go.
Greg, good to see you. Thanks for making a bit of time to come and have a chat with me. I appreciate that. I wanted to kick off by asking you about something that we talked about a few weeks back. It
Hmm.
was you said to me, corporate America have surrendered their values.
Hmm.
Now, I think I know what you mean by that, but why don't you tell people what you mean by that and why does that matter?
Yeah. So, over the last, I would say maybe 20 or 30 years, or as long as I've been doing this work, there's always been this promise that corporate America has made to their customers and their communities and their shareholders, et cetera, that they would operate by some ethical standards.
Yep.
And typically, that shows up in values, collaboration, being good stewards of the ecosystem, inclusion, fairness, those sorts of things. And typically, those are stated, they're public, and they are the expectations for which the company behaves and for individuals inside the company to behave, sort of the standards that everybody's expected to adhere to on a daily basis. Um, Probably about 10 years ago, the head of BlackRock, the largest financial services firm
Yep.
in the United States, and the CEO of Bank of America, Brian Moynihan, had began to sort of rethink the purpose of corporate America or corporations. And basically, what they came up with is that we've been focused on profit, we've been focused on shareholder value, but maybe what we really should be focused on a little bit more is ethics,
Yeah.
and how we show up in our communities, which was really sort of the birth of the ESG movement, environmental social governance.
Sorry, before you go too much further, let me just ask you about that because that's why did that change happen? I mean, what brought about the shift in thinking?
Well, I think that, for the savvy leader, they've always got their finger on the pulse of what people are sort of thinking about
Mm.
broadly as far as society is concerned, but also what impacts or affects their business.
Yeah.
And, if we're talking 10, 15 years ago, we're talking about from a demographic standpoint, millennials were basically driving a lot of what was happening, consumerism, education, you can pick a sector. They were really sort of driving some of the public opinion and so on in the United States. And one of the things that they really cared about was the environment. And so corporations began to sort of look at that and say, okay, this is something that's important to a very important stakeholder group of customers,
Yeah.
employees, etc.
Yeah.
This is something that we need to be paying attention to. I think that my description of Larry Fink and Brian Moynihan is a little bit of a simplistic view of how ESG started. I am sure the whole sort of recycling movement, all of that sort of played a role in getting us to ESG as sort of a standard or a set of principles that
Yeah.
we'll
Yeah.
operate by. But to sort of answer your question, I think that what's happened is that there have been some values and principles that have sort of fallen into what I'm going to, and these are my words, so the sort of nice to do category. And I think that what we've seen with the backing off, the backlash, the pivot away from uh, inclusion is that companies now see some of these ethics and values as negotiable.
Okay.
And, they're negotiable depending on the relative power of the institution and or the people that are challenging that value.
And let me ask you, do you see that no, negotiableness, if you like, as a positive step, part of the right kind of evolution for this thing? Or are you saying that this is a backward step compared to where we started out? I mean, what's
So
your
I
take on the
so Paul, I think the answer to that question is that it depends on who you are.
Yeah.
So if you are an executive or a leader in an organization and you have business in front of the government, or you operate in an environment that is not necessarily friendly to that value, and what you're trying to do is to save your business or to keep your business intact. By the way, that's two different things. Saving your business and keeping your business intact are not one and the same.
Mm.
But if you're trying to keep your business intact, keep the legislators at bay, so on and so forth, then dumping that value is probably in the best interest of the organization financially.
Mm.
If you are a different stakeholder group, say a consumer or a colleague or someone that works for the organization or supplier that services that particular organization, it's not a great thing because the follow-on effects from making the decision to sort of move away from that have
Mm.
a lot of ripple effects.
Yeah.
And we're seeing it now. And if you just sort of look at inclusion, we're seeing more and more people of color being sort of laid off. We're seeing less of a focus on creating relationships where people where these companies are buying stuff from small businesses, et cetera, and that's impacting the communities that they're in. So I think that there's a case to be made depending on what side of the fence you're on. Where I sit is that it's the long-term impact that I don't think that organizations are taking into in their decision making. Um, I think that this is a short-term fix for pressure, but I think that the long-term damage is going to be pretty long-lasting.
Yeah, yeah. No, I certainly get the drift of that. I mean, it's an interesting debate because certainly in the UK, I don't know about legislation in the US, but in the UK, company directors have an obligation to act in the interests of the business,
Hmm.
which is very easy to say. It's a bit more difficult to define, and we've got, I mean, lots of people will tell you we've got short-termism problem in the UK. A lot of
Hmm.
businesses, UK
Hmm.
businesses are very short-term focused. Your point is that if they don't think about the long term, they're going to do themselves even more damage.
Yeah, well, we got short-term focus here. Even if you're a privately
Mm.
held company, I mean, people are looking at their spreadsheets and their balance sheets and their cash statements. They're looking at it on a monthly basis. The pressure is a little bit different for a publicly traded company because the scale is much bigger.
Yeah,
1, 2, 3% swing either way has much broader financial implications. And the board in most of these organizations is pretty active in terms of policy and strategic direction. So we've got short-termism here as
yeah,
well.
yeah. So, okay, I mean, I get your point about people backing off some values that were espoused a few years ago. I mean, I get that. I think there's plenty of evidence to support that case. What is it that you're trying to achieve? I mean, what is it that you're trying to do?
Well, so you have to kind of look at the arc of this work, right? So in the if we stipulate that we've been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion in this country for the better part of 60 years, there is a continuum, there is an arc.
Yeah,
And the first part of this was sort of came out of like sort of the civil rights movement. So it was like a moral argument.
yeah,
And we ran on that moral argument for a good 30 years, 30, 40 years. When we get to the late 90s, early 2000s, we start talking about the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so those two things kind of bookend or are part of the continuum of where we have been over the last 10 or 15 years. And then we go from the early 2000s into 2020 after the George Floyd murder, where we start talking about racial justice, social justice, and equity. And there is an argument there that basically says to institutions, corporations, et cetera, that you have a fundamental responsibility to operate fairly. You have a fundamental responsibility to care about the communities that you operate in, that you extract wealth from, that you extract revenue from. And it doesn't matter whether you're in the business to consumer or business to business space, because even if you're in the business to business space, you hire people. And so you have a fundamental responsibility to equality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of that. So let me just kind of go back. The business case and the moral case were actually more external events that forced companies to sort of look at it differently. But when we get to 2020, one of the things that we find out is that there is a dynamic within these organizations where their employees are starting to demand
Mm.
that organizations or question why organizations are not doing work around that area. And which is a very sort of different dynamic. And then we start talking about power dynamics and shifts
Yeah.
and who really influences stuff in the organizations. So what the work that I try to do to answer your question for me is about durability and sustainability. So I don't go in with a specific kind of approach to this, meaning, hey, it's got to be a moral argument for you. Hey, it's got to be a business case argument for you because every organization is different. And the leader and the leadership team set the tone and the culture and really set the tone around what companies care about. So really what I'm trying to get them to see is that with all the things that you've committed to in your day-to-day operation as a business, where does this fit in supporting that?
Mm.
If it's a brand issue, meaning that you're operating in communities or this is something that your customers really care about, that's fine. Maybe it's a moral argument. If you're trying to sell stuff to people, if you're really trying to just drive revenue, and if it's a business argument, that's fine, but it's got to be centered in the right thing. It can't be centered totally in extraction. There's got to be some in reach. There's got to be some good solid relationships that are built. So it doesn't really matter. I don't have a fundamental approach one way or another. We've got to
Yeah.
do what's best for the business, and each business is different.
Yeah. I mean, that point you've just made about doing what's right for the business. I mean, it's interesting. I was reading up before this interview, and I mean, McKinsey, big global consultancy, know
Yeah,
their facts. I mean, they're arguing that diversity and inclusion adds to competitive advantage, i.e.,
correct,
they're saying that companies that focus on that outperform the market.
correct.
Now, to come back to the point I made about, if you're a director of a company, like I said, I'm not totally sure on the legislation in the US, but if you're in the UK, you've got to act in the interest of the company,
Right,
not in
right.
your own interests, or, it's the interest of the company. Well, if the company is going to be better off as a result of inclusion and diversity, why wouldn't you do that? I mean, you're saying there are reasons why people have dropped that.
Yeah, so we've always operated underneath all of this good intention.
Yeah.
We've always operated with a little bit of a secret that hasn't always been spoken until recently, and that is this work is a zero-sum game. Meaning that if one group or one individual wins, another group or another individual loses.
Yep.
If you think about the McKinsey study, it looks at inclusion in aggregate in a bunch of different industries, and it's not just a US based sample.
Mhm. Yep.
There's some international companies, some English companies, and other companies in other countries that they use, which kind of tilts it a little bit because um, how inclusion and diversity are implemented, executed on, understood
Yep.
in some of those other countries is very different. But what we've seen in the last few years is the quiet part being said out loud, which is that this is a zero-sum game. And what that has caused people to do is to basically choose sides.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, the reality is that there has never been a study that has been produced that has shown in a meaningful statistical way that one group benefits more than the other group. One of the things to remember in the United States is that there are certain areas of life that are integrated. One of those areas of life has always been work. People can live, in hyper segregated environments, black, white, brown, Asian, doesn't matter. People can live in those hyper segregated environments, and people tend to cluster that way. I think that that's just sort of a natural thing. There is some discrimination in there for sure, but but for the most part, people choose where they live based on some sort of demographic or cultural thing. But work is really one of the only institutions in this country where there is sort of integration, for lack of a better way to say it. So there's never been a study that has come out that have said, you know, black people um, have excelled or have been advantaged at the expense of white people by 40%. Some wild statement that's never been proven. But still, there's a lot of misunderstanding of what diversity, equity, and inclusion really are.
Mm.
And there's a lot of misunderstanding of what it really is meant to do.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Um,
I think that's a fair argument. I mean, I'd certainly agree with that in terms of what the things that I've observed. Let me ask you then, what are you going to do about that? I mean, that's what your business is focused on. I mean,
yeah.
just talk to us. What can we collectively do about that? And how do you see your role in changing that? Because that presumably is what you want to do.
So therein lies the problem that we're trying to solve for at this particular stage, and that is who is the we?
Okay,
And the reason that I bring that up is because if you look at most movements in the United States, there is a central figure or a central organization that has taken up the mantra, who has developed the message and identified what it is that we're trying to fight for. One of the things that we found out during the Black Lives Matter movement is that there is a approach to this that is super decentralized and doesn't have a senior figure or a sole figure in the middle
right.
that is identifiable. I bring that up because the diversity, equity, and inclusion industry basically, in my opinion, suffers from the same thing. About 85-90% of the people that do this work are sole practitioners,
Right.
meaning that, they've got a shingle up, they may have retired from a corporation, but it's typically just them. There are very few ongoing concern W-2 type businesses in this space. And what that means practically is that we don't have an industry trade organization.
Okay. So you're going to lobby on behalf of those.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there is not a central place for the press or others to go to get sort of a unified or central message around the work. So
And is
what
that the role that you want to play? I mean, is that what you're saying?
well that's a big job.
Yeah.
And one must be willing to shed or walk away from some other stuff in order to do that. Building a trade organization is not easy.
Hmm.
And there are, I don't know, a few 100,000 trade organizations in the United States for all different types of industries. So the only role that I can play at this point in time is to advocate for organizations getting back to their values. And unfortunately, I have to do that on a onesies and twosies basis. I have spoken at other industry organizations about this topic. Most people want to get back to the way that the work had been done up until recently. But the momentum is lacking because we don't have a centralized voice or a centralized cause or a single individual that can speak to this.
And do you see a way of resolving that problem? I mean, do you see yourself playing a role in that? Because I mean, I think your point is well made. I mean, I've traveled all around the world. You know, most places, most people think fairness is important.
Yeah.
there are obviously people that don't, but
Right,
for the vast majority of people, that fairness is a really important thing. They don't like to see people being mistreated or
right.
whatever. So most people, I think, would be behind the idea of that. I think the question you're raising is how do you change that?
So there's a messaging answer to that question and a structural answer to that question,
Mm.
right? So let's talk about the structural and the messaging sort of all together. So right around the time it was clear that the government was going to be hostile to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they were going to do everything that they could to dismantle it at
Yeah.
the governmental level and encourage it to be dismantled at the private industry, at the private business level. One of the things that began to happen was the typical DEI consultant became kind of obsolete. And what I mean by that is organizations began to rely on their legal teams and their communications
Right.
firms
Okay.
to provide advice and counsel. Um, that's a problem for us as DE&I advisors if in this conversation, for the most part, and I'm not saying it's an absolute, but for the most part, we weren't involved in what is step two here. How do we address this? It was the law firms and the communications firms. And basically what they told organizations is to back off, shut down, don't go public, don't do any of that stuff. We as an industry did not have a response for that.
Mm.
Individual advisors like myself did, who had relationships with specific companies. But by the time, in a lot of cases, by the time we were able to challenge that perspective, it was too late. The decision
Yeah. Decision's been
had
made, isn't
had
it? Yeah.
had already been made. Exactly. So we're going to back off. We're going to shut down. We're too scared to do anything. We're going to freeze in place. We're not going to talk about it anymore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, in 90% of the cases of the people of the organizations that said all of those things, let's just call it the back off group, right? 90% of them had nothing to fear.
Mm.
And so the environment was permeated with fear that some governmental entity or some right-wing group was going to come after us. Now, there's a regional aspect to this too. So maybe in the South, yeah, but in the Northeast and on the West Coast, the chances of you getting challenged around this by some governmental entity, whether it be the state, the federal government, municipal government, is pretty much nil. So that's combined. So the messaging piece around fairness is one that a lot of folks are beginning to sort of test new terminology because the employees that work for a lot of these organizations who actually fought for this as a value or fought for this as a way of doing business are beginning to question, like, what the company that I'm working for, what are they really about?
Mm.
Like, if they're willing to throw this overboard so quickly with the least lightest amount of pressure, then we never believed in it in the first place. So a lot of new terminology is starting to be tested out. And I agree with fairness is one of those words that is actually really beginning to rise to sort of
And
re-describe this work.
and let me ask you, you used the phrase, tossed it overboard. I mean, do
Yeah.
you think that in one sense some people were looking for an excuse to
Oh,
throw
100%.
it overboard? So
100%.
and so that implies that it was imposed on them and they didn't do it voluntarily. I mean, but that there's a lot of the stuff around business values and ethics and stuff doesn't appear to be that way, but you're implying that those things were imposed on them perhaps by the previous administration, or if Trump's administration is saying you don't have to, we don't want you to do this, presumably the implication of that is that the previous administration has said you must do this. Is that a fair
Well,
summary or not?
so the way that I would think about it is like, how was it incentivized to do it?
Yeah.
Like, what was the incentive to make the decision to commit to this? And for every organization, it's going to be different. Now, is there a potential wink, wink, nod, nod, or unofficial approval if one decides to commit to this work in a very sort of public way. Absolutely. But one of the things that we've never seen before is this sort of outward hostility
Mm.
towards the work, like just and the other part of that outward hostility is not just decentivizing it, but making it consequence based.
Mm.
So if you continue to do this, this is what is going to be unleashed on you. And, that's a scary proposition for a lot of organizations, especially when you're talking about the federal government and even in some cases,
Yeah.
state governments, making it hard for you to do business and making your life difficult.
Yeah, yeah, no, and that must be tough. I get that. So to come back to what you're trying to do, though, I mean, that seems to me you've got a big hill to climb
Yeah.
in terms of changing that. I mean, how do you see, I mean, what would success be, let's say 5 years down the track? I mean, give us a sense of where you're going.
So there's the immediate answer to that question, and then there's the long-term answer. I think that the immediate answer to that question is to stop the bleeding, right? So
Right.
let's be really clear, Mr. or Ms. Partner or client, what is the environment that we're really operating in right now? And what is the threat? What is the real threat that is in front of us? And then how do we solve for that? The longer term is to really understand what it is that your customers and your stakeholders want from you.
Mm.
And how do we address that while embedding the inclusion work in supporting delivering on that? Um, I'm not saying that we need to get back to social or racial justice as an ideal, as a construct of something that is supportable. What I'm suggesting is how do we get back to the idea of DEI being something that's investable,
Yeah.
right? And supportable and investable are two different things.
So,
So,
so that's an interesting point. Tell me what you mean by investable. Just
so
explain what you mean by that.
yeah, totally. So basically, what it means is how does this work help you? How is it a lever to help you um, uh, achieve the things that you've sort of committed to as a business, whether that be marketplace growth, cost savings, enhancing your brand position within a specific market segment, talent. How does it help? How does this work help you do that? Because you'll invest in technology or a customer relationship management system or an incentive system for your customers, a technology-based incentive system for your customers. You will invest in that because the belief is, and it's probably shown, that that initial investment over time will drive a little bit more profit. So where we're at is on the investable end of the work,
Okay.
right? Why should you invest in this? Well, the first thing that we need to know is what is it, what are your challenges? Like not the noise. Like what are the real challenges that you have? Because quite frankly, a lot of this diversity and inclusion backlash is noise, right? It's loud, it's amplified, it's megaphonish, but it's noise. A lot of it is just like,
Yeah. I
you
mean,
know,
that's a very interesting point you made. And what was going through my mind as you were speaking is the incentives haven't changed. I mean, if you take women in the workplace, I mean,
right.
companies sell products to women. They have
Exactly.
women employees and they have
Yep.
women investors and they have women stakeholders. It's the same, ethnic minority communities buy stuff. Ethnic minority communities work in company. I mean, so in one sense, your point about the noise, I think, is really interesting because the basic incentives, which is you want to sell stuff to people that people want to buy, those incentives haven't changed, have they?
No, 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 they haven't. But, again, one of the questions is whose responsibility is it to provide an accurate picture of what this work is?
Mm.
And typically, so you may have an individual or an individual who clarifies. That's a soapbox. and it's your voice is kind of limited in terms of how much it can reach. This is why an industry association is so important because at least you would have the mechanics and the infrastructure to promote a set of ideals that could be a counter narrative or to actually clarify what it is that we're talking about when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, my thing then becomes I'm only able to do it with the interactions that I have with partners,
Mm.
new prospects, industry groups that I go and speak to. And really what I try to get people to do is to sort of shift the thinking. Let's take race out of it. And let's think about the things that you've invested in over the past 5 years that the belief was it was going to help you to achieve the things that you're on the hook for. And let's just be frank about it. The things that most organizations are on the hook for are revenue growth and profitable
Yeah,
revenue.
yeah, exactly.
I mean, we can we can dress it up if we want. And that's fine. You develop a new product to break into a market or to maintain your share in the market. You can look at most executives have some sort of revenue enhancement or cost savings goal. So, where does the DE&I stuff fit?
Mm. Yeah, no, it's a very good point that I think because it forces that, if you like, it forces it into the foreground,
Exactly.
and it means that you've got to think about it, whereas previously perhaps it wouldn't have been thought about. Now, actually, you
Yeah.
need to think about it in the context of whether the business is profitable or not, or whether those particular communities are willing to pay for things that they're producing if they're treating their staff or suppliers poorly or whatever. I mean, it forces that debate to the front of the discussion, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, and that's the space that we occupy. I mean, we believe in culture.
Yeah,
We think that an organization's culture is really, really important.
yeah.
But if you look at some of the things that get cut when there's a revenue decline, um, some of that stuff falls into the culture category.
Mm,
So the question then becomes when those decisions are being made, like what is the conversation around those
mm,
decisions? Because clearly you're not cutting stuff that's investable. You're clearly cutting stuff that's supportable, but is not necessarily making a contribution to the overall strategic goals or the goals that the organization set. So that's the space that we live in.
yeah, yeah. Okay, let me talk to you about being the CEO. So, I mean, let me start by, how do you feel about being a CEO of a business focused on that area in the current, hostile environment? I mean, how do you feel about that?
So it's attitudinal at this point, right? Because the first thing that, I have to do on a daily basis is to get up and realize that 99% of what's happening in the world, I have zero control over.
Yeah, yeah.
Zero. And I can't be bandied about by different events that happen, whether they're inside of the business or outside of the business. I have a plan, I have to stick to it. I have to pivot from it from time to time. I have to be flexible around it. But being a CEO of a small business, sort of the energy level has always been about the same.
Mm,
It's just that the environment is so uncertain
mm,
at this point. The other thing too that's happening there's a lot of people in my peer group that are really just sort of struggling right now.
mm,
And I sort of define my peer group as like high level professionals, but also other people that own businesses of my size that may be in different sectors, et cetera. People are struggling right now because there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in corporations. So as a CEO, the thing that I have to do is to stay focused and this whole thing about not panicking is becomes really important as
yeah,
well. Because
absolutely. Yeah.
when I tell people I give people this example all the time. So when that pilot Sully Sullenberger had to land his plane, I saw an interview in Hudson. I saw an interview with him on 60 Minutes, 5-minute interview, however long it was. But there was one thing that he said that really stuck with me. And he said, if you panic, you die.
Yeah.
And so that always sort of stuck with me as kind of like words to live by. And I really internalized that. So panicking is not going to change anything. You just have to sort of stay the course and work through.
Yeah, yeah, and a good point actually. I mean, I mean, it's particularly pertinent if you're flying a plane. If you
Hmm.
panic, you die. But it's probably just as true, perhaps not as quickly. You won't die as quickly if you're running a business and you panic, but it's probably the same outcome. So it's a very good point. Look, to come back to the uncertainty thing that you mentioned a second ago, I want to ask you a couple of things about that. But in terms of how you've built the business, because you've been at this a little while now, have there been any sort of surprises where you think, God, I didn't think things were going to turn out like that? Have you had any surprises on the journey so far?
Well, I think that for me, the biggest surprise was what I had to really sort of continually learn
Mm,
as it relates to running the business because we're a sales organization at our core. No money, no mission,
yeah.
right? And I was brought up early in my career in business development, sales, whatever you want to call it. But there were other aspects of it that I really hadn't really gotten my arms around. So it's been a lot of growth. So one thing is space, like physical space where people work.
Mhm.
Has to be appealing, has to be comfortable, etc. So that's one thing. The other thing is um, uh, individual individual people's needs in terms of how you interact with them, how you support them, etc. Then there's never missing payroll, right? So there's just a bunch of things that I had to sort of learn as like I'm gonna call them sort of like fundamentals, not the accounting 101 fundamentals, because I have an accountant for that. And that was the other thing I had to learn too, is to delegate what I was not good at,
Mm.
right? But I'm talking about those sort of day-to-day fundamentals that people look to you for as a leader. That is something that has been sort of continual learning for me.
And
So
what sort
anybody,
what sort of things would they be? I mean, just give us a practical example of that.
the big thing is people management. And and sometimes that's expectation management, emotional management. Sometimes that's consideration and empathy. It really depends on the day. It depends on how things change. Understanding that people have limitations, and as much as you want to stretch those limitations, some people don't want their limitations stretched.
Mm.
Um, some people are very comfortable in the lane that they occupy, and if you try to leapfrog their limitations, they're gonna resist it. If you try to incrementally, you might be able to make some progress. But the people management piece, and remember that for me, when we talk about people management, we're talking about sort of three groups of people: customers, right? So if you've got 20, 25 customers active on your books, you could be talking about a couple of hundred relationships within that group alone.
Mm.
Family, because this work is all consuming. When you're CEO of a small company, it's all consuming.
Mhm.
And then the other group is your employees. And the stakeholder priority changes sometimes on a moment by moment basis, or sometimes, less frequently. So the big thing for me is I had to expand my capacity because it's not just about me. When you're in business development and sales, you got two goals or two jobs. Find a new business, close it,
Mm.
right? That's sort of like the oversimplification of it. But I had to really sort of, and
Mm.
that's emotional expansion. It's not something that you can sit at Harvard and learn. It's not a seminar
Yeah. I mean,
online. It's
I mean, it's a well-made point that. I mean, I think a lot of things that business people have to do are not best learned from seminars or business schools
100%.
because they're skill based. They're based on practice, feedback, observation. and learning when things work and when they don't work.
Exactly.
You can't learn that from a lecture,
No,
I don't
no.
think. So let me pick up one of the other things you talked about there. I mean, people. I mean, my view about it is people create all the problems, but people always do the really great stuff, and they tend to fit in one box or another. I mean, my experiences, I've had people that have caused me lots of problems, but I've also had people that have done just genius
Right.
stuff. What is it that you feel you need to do as the CEO to get the best out of your people? It's very easy to say. It's much more difficult to do.
It's a journey. I don't know that there's one or two particular things that are going to trigger the best performance out of people. And the other piece of this too, quite frankly, I'll just be really blunt. There's some days that I don't want to be here.
Yeah.
So I know that there are days that people come into work and for whatever reason, they don't want to be there. This whole idea of maximalist performance, I'm not sure that I think it's a great idea to get people to pay 49.95 for a seminar, but I don't think that it's real. I think that people's energy level, their abilities, their capacity, capability, I think it sort of ebbs and flows.
People describe it to me as a roller coaster.
Yeah,
You know,
100%,
you have good
100%.
days, you have bad days, and everything in between. Let me ask you about that roller coaster. I mean, what is it about this particularly that kind of gets you out of bed every morning to ride that roller coaster? We'll come back to the staff in a second, but what is it that gets you out of bed to ride this roller coaster? Because I'm sure there's plenty of other things you could do.
I'm a believer in sort of simple concepts, right? So this is where I make my living. I don't really like have any sort of flowery, high level academic,
Right.
reason for it. This is how I make my money. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let uh, someone who had nothing to do with me building this business tell me that I can no longer have this business.
Mm. Mm.
If there's going to be any decision made about being an ongoing concern or not, that's up to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of entrepreneurs would say that.
Yeah,
You don't like to be pushed around, would be the phrase
yeah,
that I'd use. I mean, and I think with good reason as well. But let me ask you about the staff in that situation, because it's a tough gig for the CEO riding the roller
yeah,
coaster,
yeah,
but it's also tough on the staff.
yeah,
What,
yeah,
I mean, so the question that I'm interested in is how do you, as the CEO, help to build the resilience of your people? Because that's really what you're talking about, is
yeah,
people bouncing back from the bad days, from,
yeah.
from the days when things go wrong, when you get setbacks or when you get rejection, or how do you build that resilience in your people? I mean, I know a lot of CEOs, and have always struck me as pretty resilient people. Not all of them, but most of them. Being an employee is a different ball game.
Yeah. So, two things. One is, that trust is built over time.
Mm,
And usually if you've got somebody that's been with you 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, they've been through a couple of bad or challenging times with you. What I did this time around is I told them that the worrying part of this was on me. What I needed them to do was as best they could not worry and to just continue to do the work, and that I would communicate with them if there were some challenges that they needed to know about. But I think I want to believe that over time I was able to build up um some um um some credits, some trust credits with them
mm,
so that they knew that I would tell them and that I wouldn't lie to them
mm.
about this. And I don't think it's any more complicated than that.
Right. Okay. I mean, I mean, again, a well-made point, really, because what you're saying is it's about trust.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. Let me ask you about the business that you've been building. I mean, what would you say has made it successful? I know you, because we've talked previously, you've still got quite a lot of ambitions for things that you want to do. But I mean, what would you say has made it successful to where you've got? I mean, what's it made it successful to date?
Well, one of the things that I think we do really well is we listen to our customers. And so it's not a transaction. I think that in most businesses, the customers or the partners will reveal to you what it is that they see as forthcoming challenges.
Mm.
And, the question is, are you a solution for that forthcoming challenge, or can you lead to a solution in that forthcoming challenge? So we've had to change our business model in the 20 some odd years that I've been doing this. We've had to change our business model 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
And it's always proven to be right. But one of the interesting things about pivoting to a new business model is that most business models right now are easy to replicate, meaning that you can have a competitor that you may lead on a particular service or a particular product for a couple, 3 years, and then you have a competitor or two who creates a similar product or a similar service, and you plateau a lot faster than you did in the past. So the goal here is to just not be too far ahead of the market, but to be listening to what our clients want
Mm.
and what they need to determine if that's something that we can provide.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that piece of advice, listen to your customers, pretty good advice in any circumstances, actually.
Yeah,
If
yeah,
you forget to listen to your customers, you end up out of business. That's been my experience.
exactly.
Let me ask you about the flip side. I mean, you've got, one of the things that makes you successful is listening to your customers and responding to them effectively and what have you. What kind of mistakes have you made? I mean,
Oh,
and
oh.
what's been the impact and what have you learned from that?
So let me put it to you like this. I mean, the mistakes have been more than the successes,
Right.
to just be honest about it. So if I had to do 2 columns on a sheet of paper, mistakes, let's just pick a nice round number, say 200 over the last 20 some odd years. Successes would probably be a fraction of that. Let's just be generous and say a quarter
Mm,
of that 200 would be successes. So the big thing that I've learned is that mistakes are not fatal.
yeah.
Mistakes are nothing to be afraid of. There's been interpersonal mistakes. Just can't get along. There's been business decision mistakes. There have been product rollout mistakes.
Mm,
They fall into, various categories. Some are all of the above.
mm.
Personnel mistakes. Um, but what I've learned, the two things I've learned is that they're not fatal, right? And you learn from them.
Yeah, I mean, Winston Churchill famously said, success is not final, failure is not fatal. It's the courage to carry on that matters. And I think that's
Exactly.
it's a very well made point. Let me ask you about the mistake thing there, because I think there are two types of mistakes.
Yeah.
There are mistakes when you think, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z, and it doesn't work. That's a mistake. But I often think that the more important mistakes, the ones that actually have the biggest impact, are invisible. And those are the mistakes where you should have done A, B, and C, and you didn't. Those are, in my experience, those are the ones where I look back and think, I wish I'd done those things, and I didn't, and I suffered as a result of it. I mean, have you had any experiences of those? I mean, there's mistakes of commission, mistakes of omission. Have you had any
Omission.
mistakes
Yeah.
of omission? Things where you think, oh God, I wish I'd done that, looking back.
So it's interesting because the mistakes of omission, I think more are, for me anyway, decisions that I'd made or didn't make in my personal life,
Right.
not necessarily from a business standpoint. I think that as an organization, we've been fairly decisive around pulling the trigger on some stuff if we saw that there was an opportunity. But I will tell you that, as I sort of look back on my life, and by the way, for me, there's a difference between acknowledgement and regret,
Mm.
right? So, yes, I'll acknowledge that there were certain mistakes that I made in my personal life, some things that I should have done very differently. But, sitting in the regret of that um, is not helpful.
Counterproductive, isn't it? Because
It's
like
very
you mentioned,
counterproductive. Yeah. But in terms of the business, I think again, I've worked with some really good people that have said, good idea, bad idea, market's not ready for it, who you going to sell it to, all of that stuff. Um, so as far as omission is concerned, no, I don't think in the business, no.
right, cool, okay, that's probably good. Let me ask you about again the flip side to that. I mean, what is it? I mean, what is it that you're most proud of in terms of the things you and your company have achieved?
So it's funny you mention that because one of the things that I continue to say to my people is that when we come out of this, this is, and I just want to go back to not, I didn't say if we come out of this. I said when we come out of
Yeah, it
this,
will
right?
pass. Yeah.
And there's going to be so many lessons around safety, um, a lot of lessons around being sort of predictive because none of us predicted that this was going to happen.
Mm.
Um, there's going to be so looking at signals is going to be really sort of important. I think it's going to make us a much stronger organization, both in terms of our own survival, but also in terms of our expertise,
Mm.
right? So, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point you've made because I think one of the, I mean, if you go back to COVID, I mean, I don't know what it was like in America, but nobody predicted COVID was going to
Yeah,
happen in the
no,
UK.
no, no,
I mean, I mean, there were people that locked down earlier, but nobody thought it was coming. Nobody,
exactly.
on January the 1st, nobody sat there saying, we need to watch out in a couple of months' time. The economy is going to shut down. I mean, that, nobody was talking about that on New Year's Day. Um, so one of the things I think is interesting is that we have so much volatility, so much change, so much volatility, so much unpredictability and ambiguity. I mean, what they call it, VUCA, isn't it?
Yeah,
Volatility.
welcome. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
We haven't learned to manage that yet as businesses. I mean, people, I don't think we've got that sussed, and there are definitely things that we could do to be much more forward looking and considered about what's coming down the pipe,
You know, it's
than we
it's
perhaps are currently.
it's interesting that you say that. I remember, I don't know, maybe this was 6 or 7 years ago. I was having a conversation with a new marketing leader in a pretty big organization up here in New England, and you know, just sort of a get to know you conversation. We had been doing some work for them, and I asked him what his biggest challenge was right now, and he said to me, because you brought up the word resilience,
Mm.
and I remember this conversation. He said to me that the challenge that I'm having right now is getting my people to operate in an ambiguous
Yeah,
environment.
yeah,
And um I personally, so all of that stuff that you talked about, volatility, uncertainty, by the way, this isn't anything new.
mm.
We've always, in some ways, could not predict the next thing that's coming, and there's always been a volatile, uncertain environment. It's just that it's amplified more
Yeah,
now.
yeah,
And the challenge that I have with a lot of folks is it's they can't function in an ambiguous environment. It's almost like the stock market. Stock market wants certainty, right?
yeah.
Certainty is, you
Doesn't
know,
exist.
it doesn't exist. So, I think that for me, I think that and I'm still working on this, but figuring out what I can control, and figuring out what is completely out of my control gives me the ability to focus on how I'm going to respond.
Mm.
I'm not saying I do great in ambiguity. I hate ambiguity,
Mm.
but I've learned over time to operate in ambiguity and not let it drive all of the decisions that I make.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's certainly a challenging. I mean, you're right about it's amplified by things like social media, but it's certainly a challenging environment at the moment, I think. I mean, um, it's I mean, you've only got to see the impact on the economy.
Right, right,
If
right,
people were doing great, the economy would
right.
be a lot better than it is, isn't it?
Exactly.
But I mean, so that's a particular challenge. If let me ask you another question. If you were going to start again, is there anything you'd do differently if you went back to the beginning, if you were starting from scratch, knowing what you know now? Anything that
I
you
don't
would do
know.
this time around?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I've never thought about it that way because because my thing is like it is what it is, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's what it has been and it's what it is now. I don't know. I don't know. I don't think that from a I don't think that from a business building or from a a building architecture standpoint that there's anything I would do differently. I might I might I probably would um have been a little bit more collaborative.
Right. And why do
You
you
know,
say that? Why do you say that? What would be
well,
the
because this is
benefit of that?
because all business is sharp elbows, right? You know, as much as we want to think about
Mm.
collaboration and partnerships and all of that, there's a high level of maturity that's needed in order for those things to work, right? So, you know, because again, we're back to zero sum game. I win, you lose,
Yeah.
right? And in the moment, it absolutely feels that way. But over time, what you find out or what you realize is that the pie is pretty big and
Yeah.
there's enough
Yeah.
for everybody. Now, some people might get a bigger slice on Tuesday than you do, but you might get a bigger slice than them on Thursday. So I probably would have challenged myself a little bit more to be a little bit more collaborative
Yeah.
and more partner minded with folks going forward
Okay,
as I
I
move
get
around.
that. I get that. And I think that speaks to maturity. I think
Yeah,
as you grow
100%.
as a CEO, you recognize the value of those things in a way that perhaps you don't early on in your career. Let me ask you a related question. If you were to offer some advice to a rookie CEO starting out, what would you say?
One piece of advice.
Yeah, well, one or two. Your best bit,
So if you asked me this question a year ago, I'd probably give you a completely different answer.
right? Because,
Well, because the environment would be different.
okay.
Um, I guess my biggest thing is have some principles and stick by them.
Right. Which brings us back to the opening thing we talked about right at the
Right.
beginning about not selling out your values. Yeah, it's a very good
Exactly.
point that really. I mean, I think the challenge with that is you've got to know what your values are. I'm not sure at the beginning of your career you necessarily do, but
No,
I take your
no,
point entirely.
yeah, but you know what? I think as business people, I don't know that this is as much as of a value, but making money. But I don't think that that's a value because the value would be how you do it, or the values would be how you do it. So making money is like the objective. That's the goal, right? But you know, what are your like operating principles on like how do you move through the world?
Yeah,
Like, do you move through the world with kindness? Do you move through the world with care? Do you move through the world with compassion? Or do you move with the world through the world like I just don't care? It's all about me. Give me mine,
yeah,
so on and so forth.
yeah. It's an interesting. I mean, I'm old enough to remember. Well, you probably do remember Peter Drucker, the
Oh,
man.
of course I do. Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
before OKRs and all the rest, all the modern stuff came along. I mean, he talked about aims and objectives, and I remember thinking about that and thinking, well, if I was going to go and play a game of squash, which
Hmm.
I used to play squash quite a lot when I was younger. If I was going to play squash with a friend of mine, my aim was to have fun. I mean, my objective was to beat it
Right.
to win the
Right.
game, but my aim was to have fun because that's the point of playing squash. And I often think we get those things confused,
Yeah,
actually.
we
But
do.
whether is business about making money or is it about having fun and doing the right thing for your friends and clients and what have you? We confuse those things, but actually. Your point is you've got to have clarity around that, and I think that's a well-made point. One last question just before we wind up. I mean, I know you're ambitious because you've got quite a lot of stuff that you're planning on doing, but what would you say excites you about the next bit of the journey?
Yeah. Um, so there's a lot to learn. And then there's the internalizing the learning,
Mhm.
and then there's the execution or the implementation of the learning. So if we think about it as a funnel, there's a lot to learn at the top. You narrow it down through trial and error, what works, what doesn't work. And then finally, so you may have 100 things at the top and you may end up with three
Mm.
at the bottom. I think that the other part for me is what is my firm going to ultimately turn into? Because I think that the work that we've been doing over the last 5 years as it relates to inclusion, for the most part, is going to be dormant. And I think that what companies are going to be looking for is something that is much more insight and strategic based in terms of what we offer. So, for instance, not necessarily predictive, but scenario based. Like, so what are the potential scenarios of this particular topic or issue or whatever over the next 3 to 5 years? And so one of the things that we've really sort of been working on is developing the methodology so that we would be able to tell people, for instance, how based on your actions now, how are certain populations going to look at your organization over the next 3 to 5 years, and what are the two or three scenarios that you need to be aware of? But that's an external viewpoint. There's also an internal viewpoint as well, and this is where a lot of companies get caught because or fall short because they do these employee surveys every year, every 2 years. Two things about those employee surveys. One is that they ask the wrong questions, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, I've seen
I
that.
don't
Yep.
I don't think that they really want to know what people really think about that organization. And the second part of it is how is that impacting the organization's sort of operation, right? Like if you've got 60, 70% of your employees that are checked out, I don't care how much money you think you're making, that money's going right out the back door if they're not being productive or if they don't believe in the mission. So then the question then becomes, how do we recalibrate the information that we're getting, understand what the scenarios are around that, and then fix it. So I think that my firm in 3 to 5 years is going to be completely different in terms of what we're offering and what people calling us to do, the job we're hired for, as Clayton Christensen used to say.
The
Um,
job to be done.
the
Yeah.
job to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I just think that it's going to be completely different because the needs are going to be that much greater.
Yeah. Yeah. Greg, I mean, whichever way it turns out, I get the feeling it's going to be an interesting few years. So, I mean, thank you for taking a bit of time to come and have a chat. I mean, a really interesting perspective on things there. And I really appreciate you making the time to come and talk about it because it's a particularly challenging area at the moment, but actually
100%.
really important area. Because the issues aren't going to go away. I mean, the
No.
geopolitics will change, but the issues aren't going to go away because the people aren't going to go away. So, thanks for making a bit of time to come talk about it. I really appreciate that, and a very interesting chat.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate your time today, and thank you for having me.
Good to see you, Greg. See you
Okay.
soon. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye.